This is a follow-up to my last video on Reverb. This time we go in depth on a few different Reverb plugins and how to use them. And if you haven't seen the first video, it's important that you go back and watch that so that you understand all the controls that we're going to go into with these plugins. This video is brought to you by Cyberlink PowerDirector 16. PowerDirector is a great and inexpensive way to get into video editing and filmmaking. Plus, with the other tools in the Director suite like Audio Director and Color Director, you can get everything you need for end-to-end production of your next hit. Check the description for a link with more information. So having several Reverb plugins and understanding all of them is actually pretty important. Much more important than having lots of compressor or EQ plugins. Different reverb units can have dramatically different sounds, so it's good to have a selection of those so you can get as close as possible to the sound you want. We're going to look at three different plugins in this video. Adobe Audition's Full Reverb, which is an accurate algorithmic reverb unit, Denis Tianov's Oral River, which is a very atmospheric algorithmic reverb, and Voxenjo Old School Verb, which is a classic style analog reverb plugin. The last two plugins are free, so I'll have links for those in the description. I'll also go over some other ways to get reverb at the end of this video. Alright, so here we are with our EQ plugins. First off, we have Full Reverb, which is a plugin built into Audition, so unfortunately you can't use it in any other programs. But this will kind of give you an idea what a reverb plugin that's designed specifically for sound design looks like. So if you look at this, you'll see that we don't have most of the controls that I talked about in the last video. The controls are a lot more technical, a lot more physics-based, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it gives us more controls as sound designers. It just works a little bit differently. So you can see we've got things that look familiar, like our decay time, our pre-delay, our diffusion. Those are all familiar. Our perception is a different tool that we haven't seen before. And then we also have controls for our early reflections. And you can see we can actually control our room based on the size of the room. So we can actually, if we wanted to, measure the room, or we could actually put in the actual dimensions of the room, which would set most of these controls for us based on the actual size. So if you want to emulate an actual physical space, a plugin like this is the best way to do it. And you can see we also have our dry, our wet, and our early reflections controls there as well. So you can see we also have a number of presets, some more bizarre ones, but you can also see some more useful ones: church, living room, another living room one, auditorium, lecture hall. So these all kind of give us a starting place, depending on what kind of space you're trying to emulate. So, if you had a shot in a bedroom that you were trying to sound design, you might go with a furnished living room and start there. Another cool thing this gives us is coloration. So, this is relating to kind of the sound dampening stuff we talked about. This gives you like a full EQ control. A lot of times when you have an reverb plugin, you may want to do some post EQ on it to kind of tweak the way it sounds, to get rid of some of the low end frequencies, the high end frequencies that you don't want. And this just gives you a way to tweak that within the plugin itself. And I'll give you an example. This is just some dialogue from one of my projects that I'm working on. Kansas via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City every day. So I'll take that, and then I can throw this on just the default. Okay. Some are on the way to work, others are returning home. And then we can try empty living room. Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City every day. So you can see that's kind of a smaller space, furnished living room. Via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas. You can see that has a little bit more sound absorption. So we can try something bigger. Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City. That's got a lot more delay kind of stuff on it. Or we also try like a small club. This via Kansas Highway 10. So that gives us all some points we could tweak. But now let's go over and look at Oral River. So Oral River is designed, it's more oriented towards music production. So it's not necessarily as useful to sound designers, but I wanted to show it just because I wanted to give you some example of some different plugins. So this one I found is a lot more atmospheric. So if I set to something like I don't know, Piano Hall. Let's listen to that. Florence, Kansas via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City every day. So you can see that's got this kind of very big, very reflective, very dreamy sound. And we also have quite a few controls. So we've got our dry control, our early reflections, and we also have our reverb and wet controls separated out to give us some more tweaking of the actual sound. So our ER and our reverb control the early reflections, and then the reverb, and then our wet controls both of these together to give us a little bit more control. You can see we also have controls like our room size, our damping, our modulation, which isn't as useful. That's more like a music-oriented thing, but we also have our high damp and our diffusion. We have our decay time, pre-delay with all controls that are familiar to us. And then we also have as well a bit of EQ controls here. So this is more like a graphical EQ rather than a parametric EQ, which the other plugin had. But it still gives us a bit of control over how our sound comes out, and we can kind of tweak some of the low and high frequency content. So I'll play a few more of the presets just so you can get an example of what this sounds like. It's Kansas via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas. Florence, Kansas via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City every day. It's Kansas via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City every day. Kansas via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City every day. Some are on the way to work, others are returning home. So if you want like a big kind of dreamy, this might even work for like a dream sequence type thing if you wanted to go really bizarre. But this is a really good plugin for big, open, very echoey spaces. So I really like this one a lot for that type of thing. And the last plugin we're going to look at is this old school Verb. So this is, again, more oriented for music production than it is for sound design. And it's actually kind of an emulation of vintage plugins, but it still is a great tool. And if you're looking for some reverb plugins, this is a good one to have. It does a very good job at emulating smaller spaces, especially. Oral River is kind of good for big spaces, but Old School Verb is good for some of those smaller spaces, something like a studio or a bedroom or something like that. So you can see, again, we have all the controls you'd expect: our pre-delay, our space, which is like the room size, our time, which is the decay time, and then our stereo width. We also have some damping controls. We also have some EQ controls, as well as our wet and dry controls. So I'll show you some of the stuff that this can do. This is via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City every day. Kansas via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City every day. This is via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City every day. Kansas via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City every day. Via Kansas Highway 10 on their way from Kansas City every day. So you can see it doesn't necessarily do super great at some of those bigger spaces. It kind of falls apart in my opinion. But if you want something like a nice small bedroom or a smaller studio or something like that, this does very good. And it can give you just a little bit of that reverb, a little bit of that wetness to help meld some of your sound effects or your dialogues, maybe some ADR or something like that, whatever you need just to kind of fit it into the space. Old School Verb is good for some of those smaller spaces. And again, full reverb is only in Audition, so you have to have Audition to use it, but it comes with that. Oral River and Old School Verb are both VST plugins, and they're both free. So if you're looking for some kind of reverb plugin in whatever you use, if you use a DAW or even something like Audacity, you can use one of these plugins in there. So those are good ones to pick up, and I'll have links for those in the description. So before we end this video, I want to quickly discuss another way you can get reverb besides using digital reverb plugins, and a much more accurate and realistic technique at that. That is to simply record reverb on location. Now this probably won't be possible for every sound, especially if you have limited time at a location or you end up using sound effects from a pre-recorded pack or ADR. However, when you do use on-set dialogue and record fully on location, you can simply set up an extra microphone to capture the room tone. That way you can mix it in with a clean recording to the desired amount. You can use theoretically any microphone for this, but the best choice is an omnidirectional mic since that will capture room tone from all angles. You definitely should not use a hypercardioid or other highly directional mic. More sensitive mics are also better, so aim for something like a condenser microphone or a large dynamic microphone rather than something small like a lavalier. You'll want to position the microphone far enough away from the sound source that you're primarily picking up reflections rather than the initial sound. It can also help to put something like an acoustic shield between your room microphone and the sound source, but that isn't always possible, especially for dialogue. Recording room tone with dialogue can also be tricky because the room mic may pick up the sounds of the crew moving around. You'll want to position it far enough away from the crew so that doesn't happen, but you obviously also don't want it visible in the scene, so positioning can get a bit tricky. If you do pull it off, though, it can make the post-production sound job much easier. Anyway, that's it for this video. If this video helped you to learn how to use some different Reverb plugins, how you can use them to achieve good results in your film, hit that like button. If not, feel free to hit the dislike button. If you have any more questions or comments, feel free to leave those down in the comment section down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, please hit that subscribe button.